Hello, this is Todd Lewis, host of the Praise of Folly podcast, here with my collaborator, Brock Bellerive, and we're here to conclude our discussion on scientism. And, Brock, last time we talked, you didn't get a chance to really flesh it out, but you mentioned some of the epistemic limitations of science. Why don't you explain some of that?
Yeah, Todd, I think we were talking about some of the underlying philosophical assumptions that are built into science, which a lot of people who do science themselves claim that there are no assumptions built into their program, which is why it can be a sort of self-contained scientific outlook. And yet we'll discuss today is just how that can't possibly be true. And one of the components of the philosophical outlook that is built into the scientific outlook is the principle or philosophical school of empiricism. And what empiricism entails is that judgments about reality are made from information acquired by the senses. So whenever one conducts an experiment, say via the scientific method, one does so through observations by sight, maybe by even tasting or smelling or feeling. And this is generally considered normal practice within the scientific community, because how else would we gain knowledge of the experiment we're carrying out? Well, another part of the scientific outlook is that the scientific method is the only means by which to acquire truth. And this does have everything to do with the epistemological system of empiricism. Why? Well, if empiricism is one's epistemology, what that really means is empiricism is the means by which one acquires truth. So information from the senses is the basis of truth. Or as a lot of Neo-Thomists, even Aquinas and Aristotle would say, we know nothing that did not first arise in the senses. So, can this be tested? Can we demonstrate that there can be contradictions within the epistemological system of empiricism? Of course, and quite easily. So, let's say I want to know something about my universe. In fact, I want to know if I'm standing still on the surface of the Earth or the solar bodies are moving about the Earth. Or, on the other hand, if maybe the Earth is moving and the solar bodies are in fact still. How would I do that? Well, a perfectly acceptable way to discern that would be to simply go outside, stand still. Let's say do this for 7 days and track down what you see. Well, what do you see? You would see the sun rising in the east and setting in the west. And you would see all the celestial bodies move about the earth in a similar fashion. Well, what's wrong with that picture? Well, nothing. In fact, that system works perfectly well. This was formalized as under the Ptolemaic system, and it worked great. In fact, there was nothing wrong with it. But later on, we would come to understand that it was just not so. In fact, we used other observations amplified by instrumentation of telescopes, which didn't arise until the early Renaissance period, to discern the solar parallax, which indicated that the Earth, in fact, goes about the sun. Well, here's the problem. Both were empirical methods. So how do we discern which is accurate and which is not? Some might say, well, obviously the one which has access to better instrumentation. Well, how do we know it's the best instrumentation? If the empirical method is the only way to acquire truth, why does it seem that it can only be used to approximate truth? If new instruments can easily contradict old empirical claims, at what point do we reach the finality of perfect instrumentation to discern the absolute truth of what we're seeing? Well, we don't know what that point is, because we don't know what the perfect instrument is. And we wouldn't even be able to tell if what we were seeing was the absolute truth of the matter at all. So it's obviously patently false to claim that empiricism delivers truth, because it doesn't. It only approximates what we would like to believe is the truth.
Yeah, and another point is when we see something in observable data that doesn't add up, like for instance, when you stick a stick in the water and it looks like it bends due to the reflection of the light, and we intuitively know something's wrong. And this instance came up in Roberto Rossellini's film Cartesius about the French philosopher René Descartes. And he, in the movie, is in this lecture hall, and he says that of course you have to have, he's being a rationalist, of course you have to have some higher rational commitment to already see that something's wrong. And when another member of the crowd says, well, we can use our hands to touch the stick to see that it hasn't bent, Descartes' like, well, yeah, but you only touch the stick because your brain, your prior rational commitments already told you that something was amiss. And so you had something prior to, so you had contradictory sense perceptions, and you had to have something prior to the senses to adjudicate the problem. And, with the modern day father of empiricism, Hume, even maybe further back, Locke, we're just a bundle of impressions, a tabula rasa. There's nothing there to even absorb or process the sense data, which is where Kant comes in and says that, well, we actually do have an active mind that actively processes the sense data, and that we have some baked in hardware, if you will, that allows us to interact and make the world intelligible. And some of that hardware was shown by Noam Chomsky in his study on language. He showed that humans, even young children, have a pre-processed system that allows them to learn languages. And so we have to have this to adjudicate contradictory empirical discoveries. We have to have some prior rational faculties, not just a commitment, but prior faculties, which would invalidate the tabula rasa or bundle of impressions that Locke and Hume speak of. And the other problem is, if empiricism is the only way to discover truth, which the cultists of scientism never tire of telling us, then the problem is you have two problems. The first problem is it's a fallacious argument. It's circular reasoning. They prove empiricism through empiricism. And of course, that's the fallacy of a circular argument. You can't prove what you're trying. You can't assume what you're trying to prove. That's not how it works. And so, yeah. So what do you think about that, Brock?
I absolutely agree. You were mentioning Noam Chomsky's work on linguistics. And it's actually really interesting because during the 1970s and 1980s, there was a sort of renaissance in the field of infant psychology, and it took on a very Kantian flavor. What Locke seemed to fail to understand was that, so Locke thought we couldn't have any innate ideas. Now, an innate idea is fundamentally distinct from an innate structure of thought. For instance, I don't necessarily have an idea of, let's say, the uniformity of nature. I don't necessarily have an idea of time or an idea of causality, but that's how my thoughts are organized with respect to the world. And that's sort of like pre-thought, and that's what Kant would have said. So Locke gave a false dichotomy between having innate ideas and not. And so he picked a tabula rasa, and I believe it was in my one college class was a Dr. Plug in Malone University. I said, well, basically all Locke is saying, we don't have any innate memories. Okay, well, I don't find that necessarily too revolutionary. What is revolutionary is the idea that there's a structure to our thought. And to get back to what I was saying about child psychology, a lot of psychologists are starting to say there is actually structure to our thought before we even have too many experiences. There was an experiment conducted where there was this there's a baby in the room, and the person conducting the experiment let this baby play with a red ball, and wherever the ball went, the baby would follow it because he wanted to play with it. So they constructed this small little wall just so that nothing over it, the baby could not see anything over it. What they did then was they took the ball and in front of the baby rolled the ball behind the wall. The baby immediately went to the opposite side of the wall, anticipating that the ball would come out. The baby did not immediately think, well, it disappeared because he couldn't see it. He had a fundamental understanding of inertia at some level. He knew the ball, and of course, the persistence of being. The ball didn't just disappear. In fact, the ball was moving, it was going to continue to move. So, yeah, this is where we could see Kant's work can actually be explained experimentally as well. It can be demonstrated experimentally that we do have basic structures of thoughts, that there's more to us than just a bundle of impressions. That's just garbage. And it's, I mean, if anybody actually believes that, I would be shocked, because it's been so well roundly disproven. And I just get a little frustrated because, you know, the persistence of Hume's thinking and Locke's thinking. I mean, no one ever really thought Locke was one among the top 10 philosophers, or even among the top 20 philosophers of all time. But so many people are very well familiar with them, even though a great deal of their work has been, obviously disproven. So we're not just a bundle of impressions. We're a lot more than that. We have structure of we have patterns of thinking that are that sort of indicate there's a creative motive behind that, an organizational principle, a telos, if you will.
Yeah. Another problem with empiricism, which again is the meat and potatoes of scientism, is you have Hume's law. You cannot derive an ought from an is, because Hume argued that there were no such things as he believed in a priori analytic statements where the predicate was contained in the subject, but that was it. And then he also believed in a posteriori synthetic, but unlike Kant, he did not believe in a priori synthetic. And so he argued that, well, whatever we get is, even Locke said the same thing, whatever we do is just reflections on sense experiences. We have sense experiences, and then we reflect on them, and we derive new ideas from those sense experiences. But there's no way to say, well, this is what it should be or is. I mean, from what it is. And so often the moral prescription of scientism is, well, it ought to be this way because it is this way. And we see Sam Harris do this quite a bit recently. And he's been taken to school by serious philosophers like William Lane Craig, just how complete bollocks it is.
Yeah, the ought is fallacies are really, because if you take Hume's assumptions seriously, yeah, it's a big problem, because what there is suggests nothing about how we ought to do, or how we ought to, hold ourselves in respect to those things, or what we ought to think about them, or how we ought to value them, which is why Hume was a sort of agnostic about ethics and morality in a lot of respects. I mean, of course, that didn't stop him from moralizing. In fact, he championed the American Revolution and wrote extensively about it.
It seems that humanists, materialist atheists are the greatest moralizers of them all. But another central assumption, equally fallacious to scientism, is philosophical naturalism. Philosophical naturalism is the position that all that exists is material. There is no non-material substance, entity, thing in the universe. And, on quite a few levels, it's ridiculous. One of the levels on which it's ridiculous is they'll say there's no scientific evidence for non-material objects. Well, in his 1948 work, Cybernetics, Norbert Weiner, one of the leading scholars of information theory, wrote this: "The mechanical brain does not secrete thought as the liver does bile, as the earlier materialists claimed, nor does it put it out in the form of energy, as the muscle puts out its activity. Information is information, not matter or energy. No materialism which does not admit this can survive in the present day." Now, of course, Weiner made the mistake of assuming that you could still be a materialist and believe that something other than matter or energy existed. But here we have firm scientific proof that there is at least a thing that's not material in the universe called information. And information has no mass or extension. A classic example could be, if you have a computer hard drive and you wipe it out with magnets, does the computer hard drive have any less mass after wiping out the information? Well, obviously not. It still has the same mass. So therefore, the information is a massless thing. It has no mass, but it's real. And it interacts with the physical world itself. Mathematics governs the physical world. A classic example would be the Fibonacci sequence and others. And yet, so how does this immaterial thing interact with reality? As he says, the brain doesn't secrete it, and it's not energy emitted from a muscle. It's something else entirely. And it's completely devastating to philosophical naturalism. It's just complete bunk.
This idea that information is something it actually has something to do with like the age-old problem of the one versus the many, or of the existence of bodies that are somehow distinct from the components that make them up. In the scientific community, there's the strand of thought, although they probably don't refer to it as this, that treats bodies as, nothing but the summation of their parts, is called mereological nihilism. What that means is that the only things that exist are the individual pieces and components, and that all other things are just arrangements of those components, and arrangements don't exist for these individuals. So, I'm just a sum of elementary particles or energy, and that there's nothing that's really different about me. I'm not special relative to any other arrangement of those same things. Well, this information paradox points otherwise, because it means that there is something there. There is such a thing as an arrangement. And what the ontological status of all arrangements is, I don't know. But what we do know, as you mentioned, the data that's organized on my hard drive allows me to interact with the world. It allows me to play a video game. It allows me to read a book on my tablet. It allows me to have a highly advanced operating system that allows me to engage with and manipulate the world. Now, as you said, if you threw a magnet on it, put it in the microwave, whatever, or just straight up reformatted it and erased everything on it, it does not change its mass. So this information must be immaterial, but it must be something, because if the state of the hard drive after I toss it in the microwave is the same as before, then we have a really big problem, because intuitively they are fundamentally different. One actually contains information, the other does not. One I can engage with, the other I cannot. And what the nature of that something is, I don't know. But intuitively, I think I can speak for most people, is that there is something there. In fact, we know that it's actually quite something else, because you have a lot like Leonard Susskind, who is, well, an atheist as far as I understand, but when he's doing his holographic universe theory, whether or not that's true is irrelevant. What does he say? He says information is a something. There is something there. In fact, you can account for how much of that something is there, and you can account for the arrangement of that something that's there, and you can tell it apart from other somethings or arrangements of information. And so there is a growing agreement, even in the scientific community, that information is a materialist something. They haven't come to grasps with it philosophically, of course, or what that means for their broader worldview. But I think that the information revolution, we are really just on the cusp of beginning to understand it and its impacts on how we treat the findings of science, or in fact, whether or not scientism can even be seriously considered as a valid mode of philosophical thinking.
Well, exactly. For example, closely related to the fallacy of philosophical naturalism is the assumption made by modern science of mind-brain identity, where they argue that a mental state is identical to a brain state. And that, again, flows from the fact that they're metaphysical naturalists. There can be no metaphysical, i.e. non-material, non-energy things. But, of course, it's trivially easy to prove that mind-brain identity is false. It's by using Leibniz's law of identity, which says that if A is identical to B, then A and B must always have the same properties. And that's the claim made by the mind-brain identity theory. Now, the mind has a property the brain does not have. And that property is, when you think of an object of thought, if you think of a pink elephant, that pink elephant exists nowhere in your neural network in your brain. And the pink elephant is nowhere in any spatial dimension that I could access. But your thought is a real thought. It's an object of thought. What that means is thoughts are private. So in the sense that if a neurosurgeon were to able to open up your head without killing you and look at your neurons firing, or maybe use a CT scan, he can explain exactly what's going on. And any other neurosurgeon could look at it and say, yeah, that's what's going on. But nobody can tell you what you're thinking. What you're thinking is a private part of your mind. And there we have an aspect of the mind that is not a part of the brain. Therefore, mind-brain identity is false. Therefore, materialism is false because the mind is not a material object. It doesn't have mass or extension. The pink elephant of my thought doesn't exist anywhere.
Yeah, I think you'd really touched on something about the mind-brain identity problem, because it really goes back to Leibniz' law of identity. If X has all the properties of Y and Y has all the properties of X, then X and Y are the same exact thing. My experience of an object is not the same thing as the object itself. And it's not the same thing as the objects, which means it's not... There's three different things really at work here. There's the object in itself, considered in itself. Then there's the object's impression upon my senses. And then there's my mind's interpretation of that sense data, which yields me some kind of experience. So when I've often heard people say, well, water is the same thing as H2O. No, it is not. It is not the same thing. Two atoms of hydrogen to one atom of oxygen does not an experience of water make. Because when I stick my hand into water and I feel how it flows and I feel its temperature, all of those things have nothing to do with H2O directly. And in this respect, water sort of does emerge from the properties of H2O, but they're still not identical. And my experience of the water is definitely not the same as my experience of the molecule H2O. So there is a fundamental identity problem that scientists often try to make. An object is actually not red when I see it. In fact, as we understand it, it's everything but red, because when the light strikes the molecules within this the molecular lattice of an object, the light that gets refracted is the light that's not absorbed. And so what do I see? Well, I only see the light that's refracted. So what do I see? What do I see? I see, well, if I see a red ball, well, the ball is actually absorbing all the colors other than red. But even so, you can't make an identity statement between the wavelength of the light as it proceeds from the ball to my eye, which is then passed into my mind, my brain. You can't make the identity statement that the wavelength is the color red, because the mathematical interpretation of the wavelength is not the color red. The color red exists solely in my mind. So even when they try to make these identity statements between the object as it exists and the object as I experience it, it's completely false. We know it's not true. We know the wavelength of the color red, and that thing we're talking about is what gives us the impression color red, but it is itself not the impression of the color red. So the color red, as I experience it, is completely immaterial and mind dependent, not brain dependent.
Yeah. A classic refutation of this position, which is called eliminitivism, is Ed Feser's rebuttal of Alex Rosenberg. Alex Rosenberg wrote an essay called Eliminitivism Without Tears, trying to escape the logical contradictions of eliminitivism. And Ed Feser, in a 3-part essay called Eliminitivism Without Truth, totally demolishes this notion of eliminitivism, that mental states can be reducible to brain states. It's a patently laughable position. It's only tolerated because the people in charge, it allows them to have a greater degree of control over people. Because, well, they have to believe that, because if we're just tabula rasas, they're going to, monkey around with this bacteria in a petri dish. If we have any independent will, that gets in the way.
Right, exactly. But a person who had spoken on a similar topic was actually Douglas Hofstadter. And I read his book, I Am a Strange Loop. And he attributes our freedom, the appearance of freedom of will, to chaos theory. What chaos theory suggests is that there is a causal underlying feature of chaotic systems that is unpredictable only because of the scale of reality that we operate at. So when we look at a chaotic system, it might look quote unquote random. And to some people, they would say that would be freedom of will, because randomness gives the impression of a sort of freedom.
Yeah, I've heard Michio Kaku say the same thing.
Right. If this freedom to act randomly is free will. But Hofstadter says that's wrong-headed, because unpredictability is not the same as randomness. Yeah, I agree, but I don't make the jump. But it doesn't prove the case that the sensation, in other words, my experience of my freedom of will does not seem identical at all to what he tries to pin as its basis, that is chaos theory with causes and effects.
Well, that brings as a related point, if man were a purely material object, then in any given stimuli arrangement, he would react the same way every time, which we know is not true. So if we have chemical reactions, assuming we controlled for everything properly, we have the litmus test, where it happens exactly the same way in a predictable fashion. Now, if man were no different than a chemical, just a highly organized chemical, then we should have a litmus test for humans, but we don't. Because you can put humans in a controlled environment, and you can provide exactly the same stimuli over and over and over again, and you will not get an identical response.
Yeah, I think you and I had a discussion on this before, and to be honest, I think I disagree with you to some extent, because and I was only treating a supposed critic's interpretation as valid. A chaos theory. When you're given two chaotic systems, let's just say even one chaotic system, the reason a litmus test wouldn't work would be because it's chaotic itself. But a chaotic system actually has complex underlying causal structures that are just difficult to keep track of and follow. And so their supposition is that, well, we are being as complex as we are chaotic systems. And as such, because there are few, if any, repeatable or repeating occurrences in our complex systems, you couldn't apply the litmus test. So that's the way they would try to get out of that.
Yeah, I see that, but it doesn't work, because as we're told time and time again by quantum physicists, the entire universe itself is a chaotic system, which means that whatever makes up the chemicals themselves is chaotic.
Oh, you're absolutely right. That's why a lot of them have actually assumed that there is no such thing as causality. It's actually just statistical chaos, where you have enough because for the most part, even quantum chaotic systems, where you would have probability distributions governing the movement of particles, the probability distributions, because they're confined to such small areas, they're given a sort of free reign of chaos. But because they're within such a small, let's say, circumference of an atom, that the individual chaotic movements of particles, or like when I say particles, I mean like let's say fermions, like an electron. They sort of become statistically normalized. You have so many of them, so confined chaotically within chaotic boundaries. You have so many of them that ultimately in the broader spectrum of experience, those sorts of that chaos averages out into what we see as causality. I'm just asking you to humor me on this, because I had studied it quite a bit. And so for them, yeah, it's fully possible for, say, the basketball on my bedroom floor to fall through to the center of the earth. It's just really improbable.
Yeah, I've heard that before.
Right, because
they use, yeah.
But that's the gist of it. So, they've gotten so deep, so to speak, that they've talked about just tossing out causality altogether and talking about causality as sort of quote unquote an emergent experience of a chaotic world. I'm not saying it's correct.
But you see, if there's no causality, then there's no science.
Right. That's what I'd really, kind of wanted to get at, because I mean, when you start saying there's no causality, then there's not it just becomes 100% statistics, which is exactly what quantum mechanics is. True quantum mechanics, at least in the practical world, is a statistical science. But then guess what happens there? It ceases to become about knowledge. It's no longer about knowing what's going on. It's about giving up and just averaging out the outliers.
Yeah.
To become useful, to become useful to the human experience. And this really shouldn't surprise us, because it really brings us back to what we were talking about. This attitude is, science is not treated. I mean, it's given lip service as a tool of knowledge, but it's not. That's not how they treat it. It's a tool for power, and so that's how they've come to. That's a growing agreement in the community about the metaphysical nature of science and reality itself. It's really just about acquiring power and treating it as such.
Well, it's kind of hard to be a truth acquiring process when your fundamental process is based on the fallacy of affirming the consequent. But another fundamental, vital foundation of scientism is the modern day theory of neo-Darwinism. Now, to be clear, there are secular critics of it today. There was the late David Stove, Darwinian fairy tales, and then there was Thomas Nagel's Mind and Cosmos. Now, funny thing, for all their trumpeting about empiricism and provability, no one has ever proven or observed abiogenesis, which is just a fancy name for the debunked notion of spontaneous generation, which was debunked by Louis Pasteur about 150 years ago. And another thing that's never been observed is any point in time of stellar evolution. No one has actually seen a Big Bang. Nobody has seen clouds condensing into a star. And nobody's seen one life form transmutate into another. It's a kind of alchemy, really. And what one of the things is they talk about emergent properties, where once you have sufficiently complex organisms, forget about how they actually get there, that you eventually develop consciousness. They can't explain how sufficiently complex organisms generate consciousness, but they assume that it does. And that assumption leads some to believe, such as Ray Kurzweil, that once computers have enough chips and they're sufficiently complicated, they'll become rational thinking computers, which on the face of it is just laughable. Even Noam Chomsky admits the idea of a thinking computer is laughable. He says it's a calculator, and calculators can't think.
Yeah, I find it funny because, we were talking about, the scientific attitude about the freedom of the will and the concept of thinking, and how a lot of people in the scientific community have approached the mind from a sort of chaos theory, causal sequence approach. They've had that approach, in which case the mind is completely causal, and of course in the quantum statistical way, not the Newtonian way. If that's really their approach, that it's just a very complicated set of causes, then what's this big deal about making a thinking computer? There is no thinking. In fact, you wouldn't be able to tell it was thinking, because this idea of thinking, it for some reason, it seems to smuggle in this immaterialist idea, or this acausal way of thinking, because causality does not yield creativity at all. What's the purpose of a thinking computer if it has no sense of self, which itself is immaterial, or no sense of creativity, which itself seems acausal? Who cares if they call a computer a thinking computer, because thinking is just another series of causes.
Well,
And,
exactly. On their own standard, you can't even think.
yeah,
But,
it doesn't even matter what they're talking.
But for the sake of argument, the idea that you could build a thinking machine is patently laughable, because emergent property is essentially a kind of God of the gaps theory for evolution. There's no way to explain the rise of consciousness in humans, and so they just have to resort to an I don't know. And the I don't know, which they pretend to know, is emergent properties.
Yeah, it is a very God of the gaps theory, and it's a pretty bad one because of everybody that I've read about the emergent theory, it's been simply a string of analogies they've tried to construct with difference, like I'd mentioned before, the difference between H2O and water. They try to say that water is made of H2O and is fundamentally just a bunch of H2O molecules, but they emerge to have a different property. Like water, it has different properties than the molecule H2O, and so they use this sort of as an analogy where, yeah, there can be this completely atomistic physical makeup of my brain that gives rise to properties that are not contained within. Actually, what's not remarkable about that is we all know that there's this other thing called the fallacy of composition. Okay, nobody today would really say, yes, if you have, water is just a bunch of water molecules, and then therefore water will always have the same properties of each molecule. No, you won't find many people making that argument because it's a fallacy of composition to say so. But you can't thereby say that, well, that's exactly how the mind works. It's actually just an emergent property of the fundamental constituents therein. And to deny it is to commit the fallacy of composition. No, that's a trap that I've actually encountered before. Because if I denied that the mind doesn't have any of the properties, if I said that the brain, it's collectively, it doesn't have all the same properties as, say, the individual molecules that make that up, somehow I'm committing a fallacy. No, I actually just first assert that, no, the mind is not identical to the brain, and the brain is not identical to the parts that make it up. Two separate arguments there.
Well, exactly.
I'm not saying that the mind emerges from anything. In fact, they're the ones making that assumption, and they like Hofstadter, that's what he said, that the mind sort of emerges from the neural networks within the brain and their complexities.
Yeah, but no one can ever give an account of this. It's just,
never have I ever read one.
It's a stopgap to explain what they don't know. Oftentimes you'll hear, that's a God of the gaps. Oftentimes you'll hear these cultists say, well, unlike religious people, we don't pretend to know what we don't know. And I'm like, bollocks.
That's a lie.
They always pretend to know what they don't know. And this idea of now, scientism has an aspect called transhumanism, where it's partly based on eugenics, where you use science to direct human evolution, and it's partly based on sort of information technology and either interfacing with or uploading yourself into computers. And again, this idea that we can just seamlessly move from one to the other is just by degrees of slight change. Again, the theory itself has never been observed. And this entire edifice of evolutionary progress we get with transhumanists and futurists, they always make analogies based on our alleged primordial ape past. But again, no one has ever observed that past. Even if evolution were true, there would be no possible way by which one could discern the path our ancestors took and what environmental or social conditions were operating on them at that time.
Well, yeah, like we had mentioned before, there's no way to measure what happened in the past. History is not science. It is distinctly not a science. It is completely unempirical. And I think you and I have come to at least to the conclusion that one of the fundamental components of science is empiricism. And you'd said that, so many, and I've heard Krauss say, the wonderful thing about science is we love not knowing. And I'm, okay, is that why you tell me what happened? You know exactly what happened 10 to the negative 43 seconds after the Big Bang.
Well, exactly. The other thing is, in his Mind and Cosmos, Thomas Nagel points out the fact that there's this field called historical science, an oxymoronic piece of bollocks if there ever was one. And he argues that what we would contemplate historically, the explanation of past events was not attributed to science. The classical science of Newton and Descartes and Galileo had nothing to do with past events. They made no claim about what happened in the past. But not beginning, Darwin popularized it, but it began earlier with people like Charles Lyell and others who tried to make predictions about the past based on observable facts of today. And Nagel says that this way of thinking is not widely accepted. But of course, it's complete bollocks. It can't be historical because there's no written records or observers to write down an account of what happened. And by definition, an empirical mode of knowing is not historical because you can't empirically observe the past.
Well, I thought, when I think about it, that just seems pretty darn self-evident. But that's exactly what most scientists seem to be obsessed with. What happened in the past. These days, where does most of the money go to? It goes into cosmogony.
Or even worse, the future. They speculate about the death of the universe. I mean, that's even worse because at least the past happened. The future hasn't even happened. And now we've squared the circle, if you will. People used to joke about scholastics debating about how many angels could dance on the head of a pin, but now we have our contemporary scholastics debating on, will the universe die in a heat death or will it die in a big crunch? And there's absolutely no way to know at all.
Yeah, and why should one care anyway? I mean, if you're a scientist, who cares what the fate of the universe is? The sun, before they at least quote unquote know that the sun will burn out before the universe ends. So, and the human race will have been extinguished by then anyway. So, why care? It just seems like it's all about making a point. It's all about, rubbing in other people's faces about how much you know. Which, I thought they not knowing is their business.
yeah, not knowing. But I think we've pretty accurately discredited the presuppositions of scientism. But I think the next thing we need to get at is what would be the solution to this madness of driving humanity to a technical abyss, where instead of nukes and poison gas, we had GNR, which is genetic engineering, nanobots, and robotics, which is the danger that Bill Joy foresees for the future. Now, one of the things that is clear is that an alternative such as primitivism, complete and utter rejection of all technology, seeking to return to a Paleolithic past, is not at all feasible. I mean, first of all, it would lead to the death of well over 5 billion people, because you wouldn't be able to feed that many people. And you're just not going to be able to persuade people or compel people to live for such an object. So what do we have? What alternatives do we have? Well, one alternative has been proposed by Ivan Illich in his work, The Rivers North of the Future, which is a collection of interviews and essays. And Ivan Illich was a kind of iconoclast thinker in the mid-20th century. He wrote about education reform and other things such as that. But one of the things he did write about was tools. And he said that historically, what he calls instrumentality, a tool was seen as a servant of man and an extension of a man. So a cutting implement, like a knife or a sword, would not have been seen as a generic cutting implement. It would have been seen as an extension of the butcher and an extension of the warrior. And it was part of their identity, part of who they were. So the tool was almost an extension of themselves. But it was also subordinate to their rational will and then the will of the community that they themselves were subordinated to. What we see in the modern industrial scientific age is that the roles have been reversed. Man is now subordinate to the machine. Man's purpose is to keep the machine going, not the other way around. And that's sort of the underlying fear we see in the movie The Matrix, where man is little more than just energy for the machine. But is it really that much different now? It's just that, there isn't an AI trying to kill us off, but we are subservient to the machine. And in fact, such a position was even mentioned by Aldous Huxley in one of his prefaces to one of the editions of The Brave New World. He said that in any sane society, man would not serve the machines, but the machines would serve man. And he gives a prescription very similar to Illich's. He's coming from a secular perspective, Illich from a religious perspective, where the tool is subordinate to the rational will of man in the service of the community. And I think we need a change of mental outlook, where we don't see tool as building tools for the sake of building tools, but rather we say the tools are an extension of the human using them and the community, and it's to serve their interests. Much like, as Christ said, man, the Sabbath serves man, not man the Sabbath. And another change of outlook that we need is the Amish outlook. And the Amish outlook is that they look at a piece of technology and ask, what social impact does it have on us? And in a 1999 article by Howard Rheingold in Wired magazine called Look Who's Talking, he mentions how he spent some time living and interacting with the Amish. And he had some interesting things to say. He interviewed this one Amish man who, there was a kind of collective phone booth. They would use it for business and in emergencies, but it was communal and not in anyone's house. And he asked him, why don't you have a phone in your house? And the Amish man said, well, the problem is, if the phone was in the house, what would happen is whenever the phone would ring, we would all stop as a family, whatever we were doing, and answer the phone. It's kind of a tyranny of the telephone. Whenever the telephone rings, you jump. And it's true in my house. That's what happens. Whenever the phone rings, we stop whatever we're doing and see what it is. And the Amish were like, well, we don't want to have that imposition on our community. It's a useful tool. We need it for business. For emergencies, it can be quite useful. But it needs to be restricted in its use, and it needs to be subordinate to the interests of the community. And I think a combination of these changes of outlook you see from Ivan Illich and Huxley on one side and the Amish on the other would help be the foundations for a new way of looking at technology. And so rather than the dominant paradigm of pushing technical development at the fastest pace possible, irrespective of social consequences, we ask first, what are the social consequences of the technology? And if they're sufficiently negative, then we don't pursue the technology.
Actually, completely agree with Ivan Illich's prescription. In fact, I think it seems to have an Aristotelian bent, and maybe even goes a little further than Aristotle would have. So my sub-prescription for that would be a sort of return to at least a basic Aristotelian teleology, and Aristotle's concept of the four causes. That of the material cause, what something is fundamentally composed of. Its formal cause, how it's so arranged. The efficient cause, how did it come about? And finally, the final cause, that is, what is it for? So when Ivan Illich talks about a tool as an extension of man, it sort of takes Aristotle's conception of objects a step further. In other words, it puts the efficient and final causes more deeply in touch with man. Where man is the efficient cause, it should also ultimately be the furthest removed final cause. That is, what is it ultimately for? And so we could say that the efficient and final causes ought to be entangled with man's experience and serve man's purpose. But of course, that I would not say that man exists beyond this. There must be a final purpose for man. So I would suggest, also taking it even a step further, is that suggest that let's do this radical suggestion that man has a purpose in this universe, and suddenly everything else must fall into place. The tools man designs and devises must have a purpose that is attached to man's purpose. You'd also mention the Amish community. Exactly, because I remember, I very much remember how opposed I was to getting a cell phone. Now, some of the listeners might laugh at that, but remember, I grew up mainly without electronics, and I didn't live in an Amish household. I just lived in a household that saw things, saw man's interaction with the world as something more intimate. Like a man's handiwork mattered, or a man's intimate social relationships mattered. They weren't something to be simplified, aggrandized, or made more convenient. They were just supposed to be human. And when I got my first cell phone for Christmas, I remember saying, well, and I said this out loud, I said, game. And I don't think my parents got that quite right away. I think they took offense to it. But what I really meant was suddenly now I became bound in some way to a social collective that A, didn't care about me really that much, and B, was more interested in using my time for its ends. And that's pretty much exactly what happened. Whenever I unplugged from Facebook because I saw it as detrimental to my health. It was not benefiting my personal relationships, and it certainly wasn't benefiting my view of man. It drew me deep into a cynicism that took me a long time to get out of, because I lacked for any genuine experience of the world. Everything became abstract. Everything became just information bombarding me with no understanding of how to deal with it or interpret it. I agree. We need to stop extending our reach across the globes in our own minds, because when we do that, we must necessarily round people up into categories that do not come close to describing the real lives of these people. Instead, rather, have a more community-minded existence, a more community-minded experience. And I think that the combination of what you described, this sort of organic approach to human experience, coupled with a firm understanding that man has purpose and the tools he devises must serve that purpose. If we do that, we can break this death grip, and it's not going to be something done top down. It will be done organically.
Well, exactly. One of the things that Illich points out in his critique of these integrated systems of social organization is he argued that any attempt to meet the needs of the poor that sees them as either the proletariat or an expression of a historical process is fundamentally dehumanizing. If I see a man named Frank who's sleeping on a bench, he's not a historical process. He's not the proletariat. He's someone made in the image of God. You can't abstract and homogenize these people, because it's fundamentally dehumanizing, but that's exactly what the scientistic outlook does.
Yeah, and I think my concluding remark on that is, we can actually see this happening where we have political campaigns in this country, businesses in this country, engaging in predictive programming, engaging in data analytics to shape and respond to human trends. In other words, we cease to become beings, rather we're consumers or voters or all these other abstract categories that reduce us to tools in someone else's machinations.
Yeah, exactly. And really, that's the only way to escape from the hurtling abyss of NBC or GNR technology. Because if we don't step off the brake, the future doesn't look very good for the rest of us.
That's right.
But that's all the time we have for tonight. So this concludes our discussion on scientism. Good night.
Have a good one.